It's time to begin, please. If granddaughter will sit down. Oh, man. Tonight we're going to just briefly overview the book of Ruth. We'll come back later to it, but we'll briefly overview it and then get into the first 17 chapters of 1 Samuel, which is sort of an epical breaking point in Old Testament history. The book of Ruth has several nuances to it that would be rich and rare, and we'll say some things that will help us get an overview of the importance of this little book. Many, many years ago in the early 1800s, just after 1800s began, Benjamin Franklin, the great American statesman, who was one of the more brilliant men, I guess, that we've ever had in our nation, was in France, the University of Paris, and he was later went there as an ambassador for the United States. But anyway, he had a great impact upon the people in Paris, and he was in the literary society, and they made an assignment to every student there to tell an original love story, one that had never been printed, one that they had written. He got up and told the story of the book of Ruth without letting them know that's what he was doing. And the teacher and all the class was so fascinated by this rare and unusual love story, as they worded it, that the teacher said, "Mr. Franklin, you must have this in print." And he smiled and said, "I did this on purpose because every one of you has no regard for the Bible or for the God of the Bible. I want you to know that this love story you thought was so great has been in the Bible a long time. It's the book of Ruth." And that must have been a very telling blow to the arrogance of pseudo-intellectualism. Another thing that's really important about the book of Ruth is it tells us something that a lot of brethren are confused on and shouldn't be. I grew up believing and even seeing on charts when people gave a review of the Bible that there have been 3 periods of Bible history. The patriarchal, and they have a self-enclosed circle labeled patriarchal. Next to it, another self-enclosed circle, the Mosaical age, and the third, the gospel age. That's not correct. The patriarchal did not end for the Gentiles when the Mosaical, or Old Covenant, was given at Sinai to the Jews. It continued. And so you can't have that circle closed and say the patriarchal age ended when God gave to his special people, those he led out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, Abraham's seed, the Jews, the law of Moses. See, that being true, we'd have the problem of what about all those Gentiles? You mean they weren't answerable to God? He had no law for them? They just wandered around aimlessly? I believe the Bible teaches that there's never been a single person on earth unanswerable to God, and that the patriarchal system continued for the Gentiles all the way to the cross, while for 1,500 years the law of Moses was given specifically to the Jews, to Abraham's seed, to preserve Abraham's seed so Christ could come. And Galatians 3 says that was given. It was added. Well, added to what? The only thing that could be added to is the patriarchal system. That's all that existed. And it was added because of transgressions until the seed should come to whom the promise was made. And he says, "And to thy seed which is Christ." The law is our schoolmaster to bring us to Christ. And so this parenthetical expression called the law of Moses, given to Abraham's seed to the Jews at Mount Sinai, did not negate the patriarchal system continuing for the Gentiles. It's interesting, in John 17, verse 2, we read that the Lord has authority over all the earth. Now, usually some will counter, and we have a few heretics among us that will counter by saying, "Well, you don't know how to reconcile Ephesians chapter 2 that says they were without hope and without God in this world." Well, where'd that come from? Where'd that statement come from in the Old Testament? Did it just jump out of the clouds? It came from 2 Chronicles 15:3, and it applied to the Jews who chose not to answer to God. That didn't mean they were unanswerable to God. They were, but acted like they weren't. He's saying these people who are God's covenant people in a special way were without hope and without God in this world. And so the quotation of Ephesians 2 comes from a setting that has not to do with the patriarchal, but with the Mosaical. And anybody today who chooses not to obey God is without God and without hope in this world. But that doesn't mean they're unanswerable to God. Didn't Jonah, God's prophet to Israel, go down to a pagan territory called Nineveh and preach to them? And didn't those Gentiles from the king on the throne, the beggar in the street, repent at the preaching of God's prophet? They must have been answerable to God. The first 2 chapters of Amos, though, put the icing on the cake. And I use every one of these in discussion with a brother who's been off on this subject for about 20 years now. I said, read the first 2 chapters of Amos, please. Those 2 chapters deal with, in the first 2/3 of those 2 chapters, Amos, Israel's prophet, rebuking heathen Gentile nations, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Edomites, and so forth. And God says, for 2 transgressions and for 3 or for 4, I hold this against you. Well, if they're unanswerable to God, how does God have a claim on them, and why is he rebuking people that weren't answerable to him? What law could they break? What sin could they commit if they're not under law to God? So one great lesson we learn here and from the book of Ruth is that the Gentiles did count and always have counted, and they were under the patriarchal system. Another thing that's very interesting in this background is that Ruth is in the genealogy of Christ. A Gentile woman in the genealogy of Christ. Well, how about a wicked woman named Rahab and another wicked woman named Tamar? They're in the genealogy of Christ. Read Matthew 1 and Luke chapter 3. So here are women in the genealogy. Here are Gentile women. Here are sinful women woven into the fabric of the genealogy of Christ. Does that mean that God approved of their wickedness? Never. Never has. Countenance sin. It simply means, though, that he can use times and people and places and things to his ultimate glory. He can work through the tragedies of life and genealogical list to produce a Savior. Another thing that makes this interesting is Boaz, who is the male hero of this book, is the son of Rahab the harlot that we studied about in the book of Joshua. These are strange and interesting things, the maneuverings in this book and what it leads to. There's also another thing that you need to look up, and really we're kind of just touching the hem of the garment tonight to set forth some points, and that's called the Levirate law concerning marriage. You read about it in the book of Leviticus, and it's referred to in Matthew 22 and Mark 12. And that is, if a woman married into a family, and there were several men, several brothers in that family, and the one she married was the oldest and he died, then the next brother was to take her as a wife and raise up seed unto her former husband, his brother who was dead. That's called the Levirate law. And one purpose for all that was to continue to build on Abraham's seed so Christ could come and save the whole world. So anytime there's a temporal, physical thing in regard to the law of Moses, it's for an ultimate spiritual end and purpose. One of the most beautiful weddings I ever attended, and everybody has a different concept of what's beautiful at a wedding and all, was an outdoor summer wedding years and years ago. And the man who performed it was the dean of a college and highly educated, but still a good old country boy. It's the first time I'd ever heard anyone use Ruth 1, 16 and 17 at a wedding. Ruth's famous words to Naomi, entreat me not to leave thee, nor to return from following after thee, for whither thou goest I will go, where thou lodgest I will lodge, thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. Naomi had such an influence upon Ruth, this Moabitish woman, this Gentile woman, that Ruth didn't want to leave her, and she wanted to go with her. And thus begins this saga that develops into a very interesting story about the Levirate law and the preservation of Abraham's seed and the building into the genealogy of Christ a woman, a Gentile woman, a woman who learned more about God. This is a very interesting and challenging book. I mentioned to you the other day that when we were talking about the road from the pig pen back home, the prodigal son on famous Bible roads, that when the prodigal son came back and his father said, put shoes on his feet, I've heard all my life, older preachers saying that meant his feet were bleeding from walking so far and so forth. No, according to the book of Ruth and Psalm 60, verse 8. If you don't get that down, you'll have to read the whole book of Psalms. There's 150 of them to find it. Psalm 60, verse 8, that was a sign or symbol that the ground on which the shoes were placed became the inheritance of the one that was standing there. And you remember how these the shoes were thrown in the land that Boaz took. One of the other kin of the husband of Ruth, and the one that was related to Naomi, rejected the claim, didn't want the claim to be the husband. And so land had to be transacted for the family name and lineage to be preserved. And it says when they threw the shoes on the ground, well, that meant Boaz was now the inheritor of it. I think this is an interesting thing that the book of Ruth sheds some light even on the story of the prodigal son, and throw Psalm 60 verse 8 in there, you learn something that's otherwise overlooked. Now, these are interesting points, and it shows how that providentially interesting things happened. We'll talk about this more, and maybe when we come to the book of Obadiah, which is just a one-chapter book, which we previously talked about months ago when we introduced some of the prophets. Since it's just a one-chapter book, we may come back and pick up some refrain. But we've learned that women, Gentile women, entered the genealogy of Christ, and that God had always had claim upon everybody, Jew or Gentile. That the patriarchal system continued for the Gentiles until the cross of Christ, like the law of Moses continued from Mount Sinai for 1,500 years to the cross of Christ. God has never had anybody on earth unanswerable to him. I believe that's clearly taught. Now let's go to 1 Samuel. We need to play a little bit of catch up, because I notice we're in the Chronicles now and the written reports out there that you pick up every Sunday morning. We're not going to rush, but we want to hit the high points. You can't study 1 Samuel without coming face to face with one of the greatest women who ever lived. Her name was Hannah. I have a granddaughter named Hannah, and I love that name. All my life, I've had a special appreciation for a woman like Hannah, this one, the mother of Samuel. But when we're introduced to her here in this first chapter, she's barren. And there was nothing in the whole wide world sadder for a woman of that day and time to be bereft of children. And oh, she wanted a child, and specifically a son. And she prayed so fervently that the people thought she was either drunk or beside herself. But she wanted a son, and she said, Heavenly Father, if you'll give me a son, I'll give him into your service all the days of his life. And the story of her making little coats and taking to him from time to time and putting him in the care and trust of Eli, the high priest, is a very tender scene in Old Testament history. But she is back of his brilliant statement as a young lad in 1 Samuel 3:9, Speak, Lord, thy servant heareth, which means command and I will obey. And so Hannah did her part, God did his, and Samuel becomes the greatest leader since Joshua. He can be teamed up with Joseph and Moses and Joshua, Samuel, some of the great people of all time. Centuries later in Jeremiah 15:1, the prophet said, even if Moses and Samuel were here, they could only save themselves. You know what he meant by that? They're the greatest pleaders and intercessors God's ever known. But they couldn't save you. You're going into captivity. You're going into bondage. You've earned it. And if they were back on earth pleading, they could only deliver themselves. I love what Samuel said to Saul and to Israel in 1 Samuel 12:21 and following. God forbid that I should cease to pray for you. There's only one thing that can mean. God forbid that you become so hardened, so crusted in sin, that my praying wouldn't do you any good. For in Jeremiah chapters 7, 11, 14, and 17, God blatantly says, do not pray for these people. In other words, rebuke them, preach to them. Praying would be a waste of time. They're so far gone. And when God tells someone not to pray for somebody, they must really be hardened in sin. So when Samuel says in 1 Samuel 12, God forbid that I should cease to pray for you, he's saying, God forbid that you harden your heart so strongly, so deeply, that my prayer would be a waste of time. I think that's something we ought to really stop and concern ourselves with. And of course, it isn't long until we're introduced to the constant battle between the Philistines, the shallow, carnal, mundane, secularized, hellish people, the Philistines, that war against God's people. And in chapters 4 through 7, we have them taking the Ark of the Covenant and placing it in a tent or temple where Dagon, their pagan deity, is. And for about 20 years, the Ark of the Covenant is held hostage. But God afflicts the people with what we'd call today the bubonic plague, because they have stolen a treasure and have mocked and mimicked God and spiritual things. It's in 1 Samuel chapter 7 we have the famous background to the second stanza of the song, O Thou Fount of Every Blessing. Here I raise my Ebenezer. I would say that not 10 out of 1,000 people have any idea what they're singing when they sing that. It was a sort of a rocks and so forth that simply meant, hither by God's help we've come. In other words, they admitted that they had been blessed to that point by God in spite of their wickedness. Hither by thy help I've come. And so that stanza simply means we pause and pay God the homage and glory for being so good to us. Now, I've said everything we've said so far to get to the punchline of 1 Samuel, chapter 8. Circle it. Don't ever forget it. One of the best ways to remember Old Testament history is to block it off in important juncture points. And starting Sunday morning up in Pottstown, Pennsylvania, I have 8 lessons in a row called Journey Through the Bible. And the very first lesson is going to be sort of an overview of the Old Testament, and then the period between the Testaments, then the overview of the New Testament, then one on the life of Christ, one on the book of Acts, book of Romans, book of Hebrews, book of Revelation. And it's going to keep me pretty busy. But a juncture point in the Old Testament is 1 Samuel 8. But it's not the first time this attitude manifests itself. Do you know the first background to give us a king that we may be like a nation round about us? Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel. People said, let's make a name for ourselves. They wanted to build a tower that'd get them up to heaven on their own effort. They wanted to bypass God and serving God and just get up there on their own. Let's make a name for ourselves. Up to that time, not only had the language been the same in all the ancient world, but the dialect, the emphasis, and everything was the same. Now, a babel or confusion of voices. That's how God responded to their attitude, let's make a name for ourselves. I wrote an article called Give Us a King years ago, and I said that same spirit is found animated in the lives of some brethren that want to ape denominationalism. They want to be just like the denominations and still claim to be the pure New Testament church. It just won't work. But that spirit has been, that attitude has been all along. In Numbers 14:4, after the 12 men come back from looking over the land for 40 days, 10 of the 12 says we cannot take it, and only Joshua and Caleb say we can, let's rise up at once and take it. But the people listen to the 10 faithless ones instead of Joshua and Caleb. And only Joshua and Caleb of all that number entered the promised land, as we've studied in other parts of the Old Testament up to this point. But the people began to yearn to return to Egypt and even the food they had there. And when Aaron and the people made the golden calf, that was the national god of Egypt from whence they'd been delivered. That showed their propensity to sin and to idolatry and to idolize what the Egyptians who had been their captors had idolized. And so let's make us a captain to lead us back to Egypt. And when you first ask for a captain, it won't take you long to work up to a king. Give us a king that we may be like the nations round about us. Samuel fell on his face on the earth, so in despair, and God said, get up. They haven't rejected you, they've rejected me. And then he said, no, give them what they asked for. God granted them their request, but sent leanness into their soul. Write that down. Psalm 106, verse 15. He gave them a king in his anger, but took him away in his wrath. Hosea 13:11. But you know that's not the only time in Old or New Testament, Old and New Testament, but people reason like that. Lord, when you come in your kingdom, let one of us sit on your right hand, the other on your left. Mark chapter 10, Matthew chapter 20. Lord, at this time will you restore the kingdom to Israel? all the other apostles asked in Acts chapter 1, verse 5 and 6. They wanted earthly domain, physical, temporal prowess, and earthly reward. Their concept of the kingdom was as earthy and shallow as it could be. Incidentally, James and John, who wanted to get near the Lord and his kingdom, got what they asked for, but it wasn't what they had in mind. James, who asked it, was beheaded. Acts 12. John, who wanted to be near the Lord and his kingdom, got there, and Revelation said, I was in tribulation for the kingdom. Exile the Isle of Patmos. Revelation 1, verse 9 and 10. So when we want grandiose things, heaven doesn't evaluate things like we do. And we may get what we ask for. They got a king, and it was the beginning of their absolute downfall. And for 120 years, in what is called the United Kingdom, meaning all 12 tribes, all the descendants of Abraham were united, but in an earthly kingdom with a human being as their leader instead of God Almighty. What an affront to God. We don't want your leadership anymore. What they really wanted was a puppet king that would do their will. You know, something God did, and to me it's not just ironic. There may be another word for it. God gave him the king, and from that moment on he sent prophets to rebuke the king. Nathan rebuked David. Samuel rebuked Saul. All of the kings had prophets that rebuked them right to their face. Isaiah rebuked Hezekiah. Jeremiah rebuked Jehoiakim. And so, though the people had their spokesman, their mouthpiece, the king, God had his real servant, the prophet, who rebuked the king. And you know that David realized that Nathan had the right to rebuke him even though he was king. When Nathan said, thou art the man, you're the sinner I'm talking about, David said, I have sinned. I have sinned. There's a lot of irony in this, give us a king that we may be like the nations round about us. But I'm saying it sincerely, and I'm not an alarmist. I'm a historian and an idealist, and I don't mind saying either one of those. I believe we've come full swing again to this concept. We want to be like the people round about us. You let denominationalism start some new kind of project, we got to ape it. Usually we pick it up when they've about thrown it away, like the bus program and the puppet deal and all that sort of thing. Entertainment USA. It's the same principle. We must be like the nations round about us. And any time that you try to prove something spiritually by saying everybody else does it, why can't we? You better have some Bible authority for what you're talking about. And so here we have the United Kingdom that starts here with Saul, David, and Solomon, each reigning 40 years. Now that's already bad enough. They've already taken a step away from divine leadership. But in 1 Kings 12, another blockbuster part of the Old Testament, a man named Jeroboam, so wicked that 28 times after he died, when someone died, it was stated they walked in the way of Jeroboam, who made Israel to sin. Jeroboam comes along and says, we have obeyed God long enough. We have gone up to Jerusalem long enough. And he divided the 12 tribes and formed the northern kingdom of Israel with headquarters in Samaria, and that just left Judah and Benjamin in the southern kingdom with headquarters in Jerusalem. So in 1 Samuel 8, God's people take a step away from Jehovah and follow human leadership of their own passion. But in 1 Kings 12, Jeroboam fractures the 12 tribes even more and begins a system that will last for about 300 years and wind up in Babylonian captivity. So we ought to be students of history, and certainly Bible history, or it'll repeat itself and we won't even be ready. We won't even understand it. See, when I was coming along 50 years ago, in any business meeting or any discussion brethren had, always the question was, well, what does the Bible say? Do we have Bible authority for this? I've lived long enough to hear things decided while everybody else is doing it. Brethren all over the world are doing it. That doesn't prove anything except everybody might be wrong. What does the book say? Go back to the original source. Not what did they do in the Restoration movement even. What did they do from Pentecost on, sanctioned, authorized by God. But it's an attitude, and incidentally, I'll say it one more time, the three key words of Christianity are attitude, motive, emphasis. If you don't get those right, you'll never get it all right. Attitude toward the Scriptures, attitude toward God's authority, attitude toward purity or truth. So may we never be caught up in this old song, we want to be like the nations round about us. See, Christianity is something unique, one of a kind, totally different. It's God's will, God's plan, and it's only the truth that makes us free. And the majority has never, ever been right. In Noah's day, only 8 righteous souls were saved. Everybody else in the ancient world perished because of sin. 1 Peter 3:20 tells you that. Only 8. In the book of Joshua, as they come into the promised land, how many houses of safety are there? 1. The men tell Rahab, everybody wants to be saved when we come to take this. It better be in this one house of safety. 1 Corinthians 12, in mentioning the church, it says there is one body. Ephesians 4 lists 7 planks in the platform of unity. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, one hope. And so the uniqueness of Christianity sets it totally apart from denominationalism and human thinking. So it's the very attitude of we want to be like the nations round about us that really gets people in lots and lots of trouble. Well, how about King Saul? Physically, he was some specimen, taller than anybody else, towered above all the people. I still think one of the most idiotic, humorous, but sad things in the Bible is when this tallest man tried to disguise himself when he went to the witch of Endor's house. How could he disguise himself? He towered above everybody, head and shoulders. That really is the disgrace and shame of someone trying to deceive men and certainly forgetting he can't deceive God. In 1 Samuel chapter 13, and you're going to look in vain to find very many good words from Saul or good deeds from Saul. He started out rather humble. That didn't last long. And he pronounced a ban against wizardry and witches and things of that nature, and then later participated in it and called on witchcraft to give him an answer instead of God from whom he was estranged. But 1 Samuel 13 is where he makes his real big, gigantic mistake that shows his true colors. Someone has to offer a sacrifice at Gilgal. King Saul's not qualified to do it according to the Levitical system. And yet he steps in vanity and presumption and does what he's not authorized to do. Some might say, well, he's a king, he can do what he wants to. But it so displeased God that he had Samuel start looking for another king. Have you ever heard people say, well, what do you do when you can't do what God tells you to do? I'd say, number 1, don't ever get in that fix. And there's no way you can make it right to do something converse to God's will. I don't care if you're king or president or who you are. We just got through with a president that thought he was a special case, could do anything he wanted to do. Like to ruin this country forevermore. Well, that's kind of King Saul, that same attitude. Only difference is I'm not sure that Clinton was ever humble. But here's a fellow who steps in a gap he doesn't belong in. Presumptuous to the core. Keep back this thy servant from presumptuous sin. Psalm 19, verse 13. And so Samuel, the prophet, begins looking for another king to anoint to take Saul's place. And I will tell you this, the only good thing I can find of any merit or worth or depth that King Saul ever said is in 1 Samuel 26:21, and you need to know the context of that. Saul, through jealousy and envy, is pursuing David, hounding him, trying to put him to death. And all of a sudden things are reversed, and Saul is in the palm of David's hand. He can just squish him like a bug. But instead, David is merciful and gracious and compassionate and released him. King Saul said, I have sinned. I've erred exceedingly. I have played the fool. My soul was precious in thine eyes this day. There's a great 4-point sermon right there. That's one of the few good things you can find in all of the Old Testament that King Saul ever said. A humble confession. But his jealousy had ruined him. He wanted this one that the people praised out of his life. Envy is the rottenness of the bones. Put that down, Proverbs 14:30. And there should be no place in the Christian's life and heart for that. One of the best accumulation of athletes in the history of the world would be the Los Angeles Lakers. And they've stumbled around this year some because their two stars can't get along. And they're both making hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars into the millions. But who's going to be the head honcho? And there's difference, daylight and dark. One looks like a giant and the other is full of finesse. And they're great athletes. But it's hurt that team because of that. And it may be that they're never going to play many games together anymore because one of them is going to be sick and sits out or hides under the bench. So we don't have to play that guy and throw the ball to him. Isn't that pitiful? That's just sports. That's not worth a snap of your finger eternally. I wonder how many people are on death row right now in the penitentiaries of the world because of envy. And the first murder, Cain, who slew his brother. And why did he slay him? 1 John 3 asks, because his own works were evil and his brother's righteous. 1 John 3, 11 and 12. Saul's envy showed his true colors. So in 1 Samuel chapter 16, but we're going to mention something in 15 in a minute, but to continue this thought, Samuel is shocked and surprised that God chooses the lesser known of all of Jesse's sons, a little shepherd boy who is so young. He doesn't seem to have the external qualities after a big old tall strong looking king. But 1 Samuel 16:7, I want you to remember that. God doesn't look on the outward appearance, but upon the heart. That's really an interesting verse, isn't it? Things and stuff and junk don't impress God. External power, that doesn't impress God. What's on the inside? Attitude, motive, emphasis. That's what impresses God. And thus will begin the illustrious career of David, the sweet singer of Israel, the one that Saul was so jealous of and plotted to kill. And one thing that really stayed in Saul's craw was his own son. Jonathan loved David very much. They were really dear, close friends. The other day, and I don't know how it happened, I began talking to Iris about real good, close friends I've had through the years. Many of them have been preachers. Most of them were young preachers my age when we were coming up. And I'm telling you, I had some of my best friends. And as I look back over the years and see what's happened, it's sad in some regards, but some of them will be my friends the day I die. Because they were really my friends through thick and thin. And I tried to be theirs too. But there's nothing in the world better than a real good friend, and especially if there's some spiritual ties and godly ties that belong there. And David and Jonathan had such a friendship, and Saul was even envious of that. And then the people said, Saul has killed his thousands, David his tens of thousands, and that didn't work. Well, let's notice 1 Samuel 15, and this is one of the great places to show exactly the work of the prophet as over against the shallowness of the king. Samuel the prophet told Saul on behalf of God, you go out and destroy the Amalekites, from King Agag to the sheep, the oxen, and everything. They're enemies of God. They fight against the coming of the Messiah is the background point. You utterly destroy them. And when he comes back boasting that he has done what he was told to do, Samuel says, what means the lowing of the oxen and the bleating of the sheep in mine ears? And that King Agag up on a hill. He said, I feared the people and obeyed their voice. Paul said, do I yet seek to please men? If I were yet pleasing men, I should not be the servant of Christ. Galatians 1:10. He said, am I your enemy because I tell you the truth? Galatians 4:16. And he had become the enemy of those to whom he told the truth, but he was the friend of God. Here's a case of a king that didn't even mind lying. He didn't intend to do God's will. He intended to do what he thought was best. And he couldn't see destroying the king and all the wealth and the sheep and oxen and so forth. And here was the answer. Samuel said, behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams. 1 Samuel 15:22. There is no substitute for absolute obedience to God. You can feign spirituality and holiness. You can claim to be close to God. But when you disobey God, you're really not close to God. You just claim to be. There's no substitute for obedience. Several well-known football coaches have said there's no substitute for victory. But in Christianity and godliness, there's no substitute for obedience. Nothing will replace it. You can talk about your dear old saintly mother. You can talk about all the good folk you work with and live by that aren't Christians, but you're sure they're as well off as members of the body of Christ who obeyed the Lord. And then we have this liberal tendency among brethren today that sort of laugh at obedience and call it Pharisaism and legalism. Well, Jesus said, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. Was he a legalist? Was he wanting us to be legalists? He said, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. What's wrong with loving God and doing what he tells us to do? How can that be Pharisaic? How can that be legalistic? What they mean is pull down the restraints. And 2 Peter 2 said, while they promise you liberty, they themselves are the bond slaves of iniquity. And I'm going to say it one more time. According to the Bible, freedom in Christ means the freedom to want to do what God wants you to do. It's not just the freedom to do what he wants you to do, it's the freedom to want to do what he wants you to do. I found out growing up that when I enjoyed doing what my mother said, I got a lot more out of life. It meant a lot to me when she'd say, son, I appreciate you getting up early and coming out here in the garden and helping me. Then sometime in the winter, she'd always get some little baby chicks, and I can still remember that big cardboard box and the light she'd put out there, and she'd say, son, I'm thankful you come out here on this cold night to help me with these baby chicks. I enjoyed that. Those are some of the best memories of my life. But if I went out there reluctantly and do I have to, remember the story of the two boys who said to their mother when she said, carry out the trash and mow the yard, do we have to? And their dad said, no, you get to. But see, it's not just the getting to, it's the wanting to do that's real freedom. All the shackles are gone. And so people who say, do I really have to do this and do that to be a Christian? You ought to want to do it. He's never given a commandment because he needs us to do that for his sake. It's for our benefit. It's for our good. To obey is better than sacrifice, to hearken the fat of rams, and there is no substitute for obedience. 1 John 2:4 says, he that saith, I know him, and keepeth not his commandments, is a liar, and the truth is not in him. Now the converse of that is in that same book, 1 John 5:3. This is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not grievous. If there's any commandment of the Lord that's a burden to you, grievous to you, you need to change your attitude. And not until we change our attitude are we going to be happy. They'll have to come back on Sunday night and Wednesday night and give generously and attend gospel meetings and teach other people and on. Some people's heart is just hardened. It's not what it ought to be. Well, let's come now to the last point, and that's 1 Samuel 17. You need to be studying for the rest of 1 Samuel and all of 2 Samuel for 2 weeks from tonight when we will be studying the rest of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. But in 1 Samuel 17, we have the brilliant confrontation of David, the little shepherd boy, before the giant 10 foot or more tall Goliath who had defied the armies of Israel. And I've got to read again one of the great passages in the Bible, 1 Samuel 17, beginning with verse 45. And then we'll be through. Then said David the Philistine, thou comest to me with a sword, with a spear, with a shield, but I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. This day will the Lord deliver thee into mine hand, and I will smite thee, and take thine head from thee, and I will give the carcasses of the host of the Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air, and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. That's one of the boldest, most courageous statements in the history of the world. Here's this little shepherd boy before a giant that's defied the armies of Israel. Let me ask you this. Do you think that all the armies of Israel, if they'd had the faith and confidence in God that David did, that they could have done at least as much as this one little simple shepherd boy? Attitude. Optimism. God and I make a difference. We make a majority. That's what David is saying here. There's no telling how much more we could have accomplished if we believed we could accomplish it. And when it comes to spiritual matters, Paul said, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength, Philippians 4:13. You know one of our real problems, and I really am going to quit on this, but I want you to listen to this and never forget it. We have the concept that humility means we scoot along on the ground like an old dog's been hit in the head with a rock. We apologize we even exist, and we really do beg your pardon we got in your way. And the demons in hell enjoy that pessimistic, negative attitude. And just as surely as a person is bold and aggressive and optimistic and straightforward, we think he's arrogant. How about David here? How about Paul? We're going to have to capture the zenith of that enthusiasm, that trust in God. The Lord said, I'll never leave you nor forsake you, so that we may boldly say, he didn't say apologetically say, boldly say, the Lord is my helper, I'll not fear what man shall do unto me. I still think my dad did me a great favor when he taught me, son, you're no better than anybody else, and no one else is better than you. God made you both in his image. Go out there and serve God who made you, and don't apologize for it. I think that's important. That's not arrogance. And that's not scooting on the ground like an old dog's been hit in the head with a rock either. I come to thee in the name of the Lord of Israel, who'll give me into your hands this day. You defied all armies of Israel. In essence, he's saying that's stopping right here, right now, today. So if we really believe and trust in God and believe the power of the gospel is God's dynamite to save, Romans 1:16, look what we can accomplish. Let's don't apologize for truth. Let's believe it and obey it and tell others about it.